All right, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I am Andrew, aka Sexual Repression Rupturing Mindgasms, and I'm going to continue my series on the post-structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault, his book called The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and talk about basically ruptures in sexual taboos and mechanisms of sexual repression in this paragraph that I'm going to get into. And he talks about basically how these taboos have changed and there have been ruptures in the mechanisms of sexual repression between the 17th century and the 20th century in the taboos of promiscuity, perversion, laws to do with all of these and all of the other things, and along with the sexuality of children, by which he means if you've watched, as you know, if you've watched my previous two videos on this book, he means basically healthy, natural child sexualization in the process of childhood development that was heavily frowned upon and seen as a taboo in the 1700s in particular, as was the case with the other ones. And he talks about how there was a mild difference, but still a notable difference um, between the way society viewed these things in the 17th century and the 20th century. So yeah, did a cool little thumbnail here. Found some great pictures there for that. Apparently, Foucault provides 100% effectiveness with birth control, even more so than condoms and birth control pills. And the Toy Story character, Buzz Lightyear, is talking about how there will be perverts everywhere. Anyway, so let me get into this paragraph here, and I'll stop a few times and just comment on it. And well, basically, I think this is a good phrase, and you could kind of combine it into combine two aspects of this into one phrase, basically. So the paragraph starts off: the history of sexuality supposes two ruptures if one tries to center it on mechanisms of repression. So he's talking about ruptures in the mechanisms of oppression, specifically ruptures in the mechanisms of sexual repression. And he basically gets into how these taboos have been mechanisms of sexual repression. So basically, it's about the ruptures in the mechanisms of in sexual taboos and the mechanisms of sexual repression between the 1600s and the 1900s. All right, so the history of sexuality supposes two ruptures if one tries to center it on mechanisms of repression. The first, occurring in the course of the 17th century, was characterized by the advent of great prohibitions, the exclusive promotion of adult marital sexuality. So this is part of the aspect that I've talked about that he mentions in previous paragraphs, or we've discussed this in previous videos, about how he talks about how it's not necessarily the case that during the Enlightenment, which for him he focuses specifically on the period of the 1600s to the 1800s. It's not that during the so-called Victorian era or whatever, it was all repression. It's basically these two dichotomies were fighting against each other all the time. And there was he goes on, like in this paragraph, for example, to talk about other taboos that were part of sexual repression, or the repression of sexuality specifically, rather. But it was also juxtaposed with the promotion of sexuality in some ways. And one of the ways that sexuality was actually promoted harshly rather than repressed was the exclusive promotion of adult marital sexuality. So sexuality was seen as a good thing and a great thing within the confines of a marriage. No, but premarital sex and sex outside of marriage, if you're single or having sex with other people, let alone cheating on your spouse, is an inherently bad thing. But specifically premarital sex and sex just like if even if you've been divorced or something in any way without outside of the confines of marriage. So that's one of those ways that this was happening. He talks about many other examples of this, about how sexuality was in some ways suppressed and in other ways highlighted. They like some aspects of it get highlighted in order for it to be problematized. Like when he talks about the sexuality of children, for example, he talks about how the sexuality of children was actually focused on more so in the 17th century than at any other period of history before that, because in order to problematize it, he doesn't use that word, but he talks about how the institutions of science and religion during the 17th century in the Enlightenment basically started focusing on child sexuality like they never had before, in order to declare just even like nothing fucking perverted or creepy or weird, but just even the healthy natural expression of sexuality in children as part of healthy natural childhood development. Like, oh, I have a penis, what does this do, that sort of thing, like just discovering your body parts. So that was focus. So it was simultaneously frowned upon, but also obsessed over, as were many other aspects of sexuality, particularly aspects of sexuality that were deemed as abnormal or literally declared sinful by religion and declared to be psychiatric and medical and biological flaws in the institution of science. All right, so the first taboo in the 17th century was the exclusive promotion of adult marital sexuality, along with the imperatives of decency. You must be a decent person, not show this smut of sexuality in public. The obligatory concealment of the body. So, this typical notion that you must conceal yourself. Do not show your bosoms, madam. Let's cover up those chair and table legs because they make men too horny. We can't have women going around showing their knees either. That would be, oh, just so terrible. Okay. So the obligatory concealment of the body. That's another way that, the institutions of science and religion and culture in general, and he talks about the state, to the institution of the state as well, in the way that laws were made to prevent these things and to cause these things to happen. There's a focus on showing the body so much in because there was such a paranoia about how much of a bad thing it was. So there was these two just kind of different narratives juxtaposed with each other. We're going to obsess over it and mention it to people more than ever before because we're so paranoid about how bad these things are, like quote unquote decency or revealing any part of the body, right? Okay, so those are oh yeah, also the reduction to silence and mandatory reticencies of languages. Oh, reticences of language rather. So of course, in language as well, you're not supposed to talk about sex in public in the 1600s. It's a taboo to talk about sexuality, especially sex outside of marriage. Talk about how scantily clad women are. If you happen to see a scantily clad woman, and be harshly judgmental about it, because you're supposed to conceal the body and you're supposed to remain silent in talk about sex and sexuality. So there's this obsession over sex, and people are talking about it more than ever before, basically just to demonize it and like psychologize it and label it as a psychiatric disorder and a medical flaw and an unholy sin if you talk too much about sex or have sex outside of marriage or dress as a scantily, or be a scantily clad woman or man in any way, or just be revealing or appreciating the sexual appearance of someone else. So then he gets on to how these have changed between the 17th century and the 20th century. So these were he referred to those others as the first. So then he carries on here. The second, a 20th century phenomenon, was really less a rupture than an inflection of the curve. So he's talking about how it wasn't it wasn't so much a rupture in the mechanisms of repression, which are sexual taboos, but more of like a slight bending of this curve without quite rupturing it. So there's a that's a good metaphor. These taboos are decreased, but they haven't completely gone away. This was really less a rupture than an inflection of the curve. This was the moment when the mechanisms of repression were seen as beginning to loosen their grip. One passed from insistent sexual taboos to a relative tolerance, so relative tolerance, right, with regard to prenuptial or extramarital relations. So it's there's a relative tolerance rather than it being like an unholy taboo and literally declared a sin by the institution of religion and the church, a psychiatric, medical, and biological flaw by the institution of science, and a crime by the institution of the state. It went from being considered that to being mildly tolerated, not necessarily a crime, not necessarily a sin, and not necessarily a medical, psychiatric, or biological flaw. Or maybe you just still saw those things that way, but you weren't all paranoid about it and like trying to get those people arrested or excommunicated from churches or put into a mental institution if you do something like have sex before marriage or cheat on your wife or husband, or have some evil kinky threesome involving some third person with you and your spouse. So sex outside of marriage was certainly more tolerated than it had been hundreds of years before, in the 1600s. So relatively tolerated. Also, the disqualification of quote unquote perverts diminished. Now, he doesn't mean, and if you've watched my previous videos on this, you'll know that he doesn't necessarily mean perverts in the way that we normally use the word, like not like a pedophile or some shit like that, or some peeping tom or something, or someone who like looks in some woman's window when she's getting dressed or some shit like that. He talks about this basically artificial construction of the category of perversion, meaning the like sexuality in any way that was not seen as quote unquote normal by these institutions of society that he focused on so much. So the institutions of the state in the form of laws, the institution of religion in the form of the church, and the institution of science in the form of scientific studies determining that, for example, if you were gay, he uses this example a lot because he himself was gay. If you were gay for most of the Enlightenment, you were seen by the institutions of science, religion, and the state as a pervert, and this was punishable by law. You could be declared sinful and medically, psychiatrically, and biologically flawed if you were gay. All of those ones that actually we do still consider perverted today, like if you're a pedophile or a peeping tom or something like that, or if you're bisexual, he talks about that example as well, or if you're not even sexualizing children in a perverted way, like I say, but the sexualization of children in the way he talks about, which is just something that is normally examined now as part of childhood development. Like, Freud's famous for that, along with plenty of other people that it was seen as perverted by the institutions of science, religion, and the state, along with others, to even consider the fact that children, as part of their natural, healthy childhood development, discover their bodies. Like, oh, I have a penis, or oh, I have a vagina. Let's discover what it does, as natural childhood curiosity that has nothing to do with being some fucking creeper pervert, right? Um, so this kind of perversion, anyway, in what we see as a healthy way now, was mildly tolerated, more so before. People, if between the 17th and the 20th century, people became slightly more tolerant of what was seen as perverse behaviors, such as gay people. Oh, he also talks about specifically sodomy or anal sex. Even if you were straight people, like if you're a guy who wants to fuck a woman in the ass, or if you're a guy who wants to get fucked in the ass by another guy or by a girl with a strap on, that was seen as perverted too. So between the 17th and the 20th century, kinks, gay people, bisexual people, probably he would talk about trans people in today's world too, if you were talking about examples of that. So these classifications of sexuality that were seen as abnormal and perversions and literally crimes, sins, and psychiatric flaws in the 16th century went from being that to being mildly tolerated in the 20th century. And also, he goes on here to talk about their condemnation by the law was in part eliminated. So they repealed some of the laws, like, in between the 1600s until the 20th century, it was literally illegal to be gay. One famous example of that is that, of course, Alan Turing, who helped break Nazi codes during World War II and basically had a huge hand in inventing the modern computer. He was sterilized for being gay, and this hasn't been confirmed, but he allegedly committed suicide due to being sterilized for being gay, because it was literally illegal for you to be gay. Not just a sin declared that way by the institution of the church and religion, which was way more of a big deal in the 1600s than it was in the 1900s too, because societies became less religious, right? And also, with the advent of the Enlightenment, the world became less religious and more scientific. So, being declared medically, psychiatrically, and biologically flawed was even more of a bad thing than being considered sinful by the church. And it being illegal was obviously even more, because you could fucking get sterilized like Alan Turing did, or get thrown into jail for years just for being born gay, basically. Um, so their condemnation by the law was in part eliminated. So there weren't as many laws preventing homosexuality and kinks and premarital sex and that kind of shit. And, like psychiatrists helping children who might have childhood development problems, that, like, part of them, like even parents also talking about children, about the process of discovering their bodies, like you have a penis or a vagina, not in any kind of fucking creepy way. So the condemnation by law, the condemnation of perverts by the law was in part eliminated. A good many of the taboos that weighed on the sexuality of children were lifted. So yeah, again, I wanted to preemptively say that before, um, that mention specifically the sexuality of children, because, like I was saying, and as you may have noticed if you watched my previous videos on history of sexuality, by the sexualization of children, he doesn't mean like being a fucking pedophile towards children and looking at children sexually. He means the healthy natural development of children's sexuality by discovering that they have sexual organs as part of their childhood development, which is basically normal in the institution of science now, like psychiatry, for example. But yeah, so that's basically what's going on in this particular paragraph in the history of sexuality. Foucault's talking about the rupturing of the mechanisms of sexual oppression and the taboos that became the norm through the institutions of science, religion, and the state rather in the 17th century, and how those ruptured, not completely, but he used the image of how, something was bending, but it didn't quite rupture, so they mildly ruptured perhaps, or didn't quite rupture between the 17th century and the 20th century. So yeah, hope you found that interesting. Foucault has some really interesting, complex thoughts, as always, and I think it's good to explain this because I have to reread a paragraph 3 times often for me to understand what's totally going on. So I think it's really useful to break his work down like this. Anyway, yeah, thanks to everyone for watching this video. Look forward to the next ones. I'll still be doing some more videos on Foucault's History of Sexuality, and check out my last video I did, which was basically partially agreeing and partially disagreeing with Brian Callen, a comedian and actor, and Gad Saad, the evolutionary psychologist and podcaster, in their criticism of both the famous militant atheist Sam Harris and also the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson. I basically agree with their criticisms of Sam Harris, but disagree with their criticisms of David Sloan Wilson. And yeah, also this weekend, check out, we're going to talk about episode 3 and 4 of the new House of the Dragon show. That's, of course, a prequel to Game of Thrones. And yeah, like I always say, subscribe to the channel, click that like button, share this everywhere, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos, and check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video, as always, and if you give me $10 a month, you can vote on future books, movies, and topics that I will discuss both by myself and with others. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And read Foucault's work, The History of Sexuality. It's very complicated and verbose and abstract and pedantic, but if you really focus on it and get into what he's really talking about, it's really fascinating. And I think it's good to develop a deep understanding of Foucault because he made a lot of really good and interesting points, even though I don't totally agree with all of them. And he's just endlessly fucking strawmanned and demonized by people who clearly don't have the slightest fucking clue of what they're talking about whenever they mention him, like Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay, Gad Saad is one of them, and countless other intellectuals. Whenever they mention postmodernism, they clearly don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So yeah, thanks again everyone for watching this, and adios until next time.